Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and some players recently have noticed that with the recent build of 9.1, which surprisingly we even have a build because of TBC release, but with the recent build of 9.1, they noted that there wasn't too much in terms of class changes. There was majority focus on the PvP side of things, but not super much on the PvE side, which leads some players to believe that majority of the PvE changes for classes is final for patch 9.1. We don't really know when 9.1 is going to be coming out, but if this is the final look at some of the classes, I wanted to highlight a couple of class specs as a DPS that are still kind of feeling a little bit awkward in terms of going into this new patch. Some of the specs that are just not seen as super popular from the PvE side of things, and what could Blizzard do in order to make some of these specs better, because I still think there needs to be somebody who needs to look at these specs in terms of adjustments, because there's a lot of cool potential behind them that just need to be something done. So let's take a look at the list we have today. First of all, we'll be taking a look at Subtlety, who actually is a spec that performs really well in PvP, but does struggle in PvE. For triple DPS specs, a lot of it is going to come down to damage. Whichever one does the most damage is the one that people are going to want to play. Currently, Subtlety is behind that of Assassination and Outlaw when it comes to single target, which Assassination has a focus for, or Big Boss, AoE, and Cleave, which Outlaw has a focus for. I feel like the problem with Subtlety is, I guess it could be the damage. You could fix it potentially with better gear in the next patch, maybe with certain trinkets, but I feel like what would help the spec the most for longevity is having a focus. What part of PvE combat, DPS stuff, is it really good at? And I don't think it really has anything good at besides constant crowd control, which can be useful in Mythic Pluses because of Shadowlands, giving you access to cheap shot, so you can constantly stun multiple enemies over and over, but it just, I feel like, is not enough. It needs some kind of a focus when it comes to damage output if Blizzard does want to move away from having certain specs be good because of meta or because numbers are high enough. I feel like having some kind of a focus in terms of what it's really good at, maybe big AoE damage, maybe funnel damage like it used to, maybe 2 target cleave, 1 target burst situations, anything would help Subtlety if it had more of a focus behind the spec. Feral Druid is another one that's super enjoyable to play, but when it comes to a lot of pug groups for Mythic Pluses and raids, Ferals I feel like are often overlooked at. It doesn't happen as often as you may think, but sometimes when I'm pugging for groups, players make sure to whisper me before they invite me to the group or decline me, just to make sure that I'm playing balance, and sometimes when I tell them nope, I just get declined instantly. Feral is actually a really good spec with plenty of single target damage. It has insanely good mobility and group utility for mobility as well. You also bring out the things that a Druid does with Soothe, Typhoon, Ursul's Vortex. The off-healing provided from Heart of the Wild can be incredibly good, but compared to a balanced Druid, it just doesn't bring the same toolkits that Boomy has. And right now, Boomkin toolkit is just almost necessary inside of raids, and in most cases preferred in Mythic Pluses. Unless Blizzard wants to really amp up the damage of a Feral Druid, I feel like it's going to be hard in the future for it to be competitive. So maybe some sort of a buff that a Feral Druid brings might be necessary. I don't even think you're going to end up fixing the spec if you end up bringing something like Innervate to the spec, because a Boomkin will always be able to do damage at a safety where a Feral needs to really get into the fray, which does put him in a compromised position in Mythic Pluses as well as in raids. So I think they need to have some sort of an extra utility, potentially a buff, and with TBC seeing how many classes and specs have different buffs that they bring for raids, even the off-meta specs can bring something useful to the team composition. I think it'd be kind of cool if Blizzard considered seriously adding some sort of a unique buff that only a Feral Druid brings for raids and dungeon groups. Maybe there are other solutions that you guys can think of in terms of how to help Ferals be more likable in groups. Be sure to let me know in the comments below if you have a better idea than I do, because I love playing Feral and I think more people should be able to play them. But pugs are pugs, and I'm just trying to solve the issue of making a class more likable. While we're on the same topic, let's talk about Enhancement real quick, because it's very similar to Feral. Compared to Elemental, it doesn't really bring anything new. You are in melee, so you're putting yourself in harm's way, but maybe for not as big of a payoff, as you could just be doing very similar damage and similar output, just at range. Like Feral, I think Enhancement is a very fun playstyle, and it's my favorite, but I feel like when it comes to trying to play yourself some Enhanced, it does, I feel like, is missing that one thing, and it's going to live in the shadow of Elemental, like Feral living in the shadow of Boomy, because you can always just go with that other spec and actually have yourself a much bigger advantage. So if you are going to be melee, I feel like it does need something extra. Survival Hunter is another spec, but this one is at least a little bit more straightforward in terms of what it's lacking. Survival, again, lives in the shadows of Beast Mastery and Marksman. It's a melee hunter, a really cool concept that I feel like in some cases holds it back, because you really got to get into melee and you're really squishy. I would imagine the spec called Survival should be a little bit more survivable and maybe even more durable within close gameplay combat. The spec itself, I think, does need some kind of a buff. If you are going to be bringing in a melee hunter, I think maybe it could be one of the specs, and players have talked about this before, maybe as a substitute spec. Let's say your group is missing some kind of a buff, Survival Hunter could maybe get that unique buff, maybe sharing a buff with monks or something, where yes, it could bring a Windwalker, Brewmaster, or Mistweaver to your group, or you could substitute that with a hunter, a survival hunter, who brings him to look at as a hunter with the same buff, but you would be put into a melee, but it would at least give you like a unique element to what you bring to the group. Another issue for survival is the single target damage and the haste reliance with secondary stats. Blizzard is trying to make their single target damage a little bit better, but from early numbers, it doesn't look like that'll be enough. Maybe gear will end up making a better change for it, but with how low your mastery is in terms of value and just how high of value you get from haste, with secondary stats having DRs and breakpoints, you are going to end up hitting your limit. And I think like because of these bottlenecks, survival is going to be the spec that's going to probably feel it the most. When you are at the point where you're getting the best in slot gear, the most amount of secondary stats, you really just start to see your spec not grow nearly as much as some of the others. The playstyle also feels fine, but it feels, compared to some of the other classes, you have so many different abilities that are all interconnected and play off of one another. Survival abilities are very standard and kind of do their own thing. You have a basic builder spender, a basic dot ability that doesn't weave into your playstyle at all unless you talent for it, grenades that are just kind of there, carve that does work to get your grenades back quicker if you do hit multiple enemies with it, but besides that, that's about as far as interaction and playability off of abilities goes for survival. There's a lot of abilities that just kind of stand alone, and I feel like the spec could use from maybe making certain talents more baked into the playstyle and given more competitive talent options. Arcane Mage is another spec that's DPS that doesn't really get a lot of play, mostly because fire is popular. So again, a triple DPS spec that's legitimately super enjoyable. A variety of different covenants to play, but the covenants kind of show a little bit of an issue with Arcane Mage. Mages haven't really seen a massive change in the game for quite a while, and while fire has an execute mechanic, good opener damage, mobility while casting, a lot of livability and survivability, some decent cleave with your mastery with Phoenix Flames, Arcane Mage doesn't have any of those things. It just doesn't really have such a flexible damage profile. It's very good at very specific things, mostly having to do with big burst nuke damage. There's some possibility that with fire nerfs, Arcane might see a lot more gameplay, but as of right now, I feel like all three mage specs are a bit too rigid in terms of what they're good at and what they're not. And maybe there's a lot of room in terms of the talent tree in order to give them more options and opportunities to perform a variety of different damage styles and damage options just from the talents themselves. Some of the talents do seem like they're very constricted and very specific for one talent is really good and dominant in the row. And there's not a lot of wiggle room, so maybe that could be alleviated a lot through the talent tree itself. Demonology is another spec that's also not super popular, even though I'm very much enjoying it, and with the recent nerfs to Affliction, it could have potential going forward as a really strong single target damage spec. There's not a lot of parts in the fights for the next raid that would allow your pets to have any issues or bugs. You are having to rely off of AI in order to do a lot of the damage for you, so if they can't reach the boss or bug out in the fight, you're not doing any damage whatsoever. Definitely one of the things to be considered or potentially fixed going forward for Demonology. But also, I feel like it doesn't have the widest profile of abilities. You can either go for a big nuke to kind of pull enemies together and nuke them down, or just keep sending waves and waves of demons at a singular boss with kind of overrunning them in a single target situation. Multi-target, not a lot of options. Maybe spread AoE, not a lot of options. I feel like there's a lot of potential in the talent rows to be able to maybe summon certain demons with very specific jobs. And like Arcane, I feel like maybe there's some refreshers in the talent tree for certain talents that are just not super competitive or don't really fit the theme of Demonology super well. I feel like there's a lot of room to grow there. Again, with the spec, Affliction is getting nerfed, so Demonology might have a little bit more of a play, but those are some of the things that I've noticed in terms of my play. There's a bit of rigidity to it. However, if any of these classes are not considered for 9.1 with any of the future updates, and if we are expecting 9.1 to come out very soon, there's always opportunity for a patch 9.1.5, as Blizzard in previous expansions generally does a lot of the class updates for the 0.5 patches. So hopefully they'll consider something different for all these. I really want to see more Shadow Priest-esque reworks going from BFA into Shadowlands. I feel like they had a really awesome rework. The dots, the abilities make sense, and the mastery got massively improved. And I feel like a lot of these specs could maybe see something of similar style reworks. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Which specs do you think need a bit of a rework or a bit of a tune-up right now? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.